All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. All right. Thank you all for coming here, for being here tonight. Look forward to discussions, questions, comments, inshallah. So this is part 2 in a series we started on intellectual history. So the first part we covered was on manuscripts, the history of Islamic manuscripts. And I'm curious if anyone here might remember the definition of a manuscript. What is a manuscript? Feel free to answer. What characterizes a manuscript? You can blurt it out. Sorry? A paper documentation of a work? Yes. Handwritten. Yeah, exactly. That's the technical definition. Anything that is handwritten is a manuscript. And of course, it has other features to the definition. It has a structure, a codex, it's stacked up, leaves, so forth. But basically, it's handwritten. And so what that does is it distinguishes it from printed books. So everything that is printed, and it's not a manuscript. And so today, we're going to be talking then about printed books in Islamic history. Last time we covered handwritten manuscripts, but now we're moving on to printed books. And so before I continue though, I just wanted to take a step back to talk about, the significance of this field, history of printing. Oftentimes when we think about history, it's usually the history of famous people, heroes, big personalities. We get inspired by them. There's also the histories of empires, the rise and fall of empires, history of war, of politics. These are the major, types of histories we learn in our regular schools that we're exposed to usually. But there are so many other fields of history too, which might not be as flashy or as exciting, so to speak, but they're also very important. And so the history of printing and the history of the book, these are two fields which have emerged in the last couple of decades, which have become more and more popular. And even though it might seem very niche, very specific, it's something that that speaks to a huge array of topics, right? So it's not just the history of print technology, but it's how knowledge, how information spread, how it circulated. What was the relationship between a book and a reader, between the book and an editor, a publisher? How did people in one geography, in one area of the world, say South Asia, read books as compared to people in the Middle East or in North Africa and so forth? And how did knowledge flow between the two areas? There's a question of linguistic transformations. How is language affected as people began to print books? So, for instance, you have the emergence of dictionaries between multiple languages, or you have translations. You have the growth of new languages such as Urdu, which coincides with the growth of print technology. And then there's also questions of religious authority. As more and more people get access to books, as books become cheaper, what impact does that have on the authority of the ulama and the scholars to control what people are reading, what kind of ideas are being exposed to, what kind of critiques are being made in the public sphere? So the history of printing is connected to these larger questions and topics related to, knowledge production, reading books, selling books, printing, editing books, the questions about language, about authority, not only of religious people, but also of, countries, the idea of civil society, the idea of citizenship, being connected to a political cause, and so forth. So this is just a broader overview of the history of printing. In today's talk, I'm just going to give you a brief outline. I'll be conducting a brief survey of the history of printing across different geographies. So China, we'll start with China for reasons I'll mention, go on to Europe, and then the Ottoman Empire and South Asia. And so, inshallah, it'll be a light presentation. I have lots of pictures to show you, and yeah. Okay, so the emergence of printing, as is known traditionally, began in China, right? In the 7th century, the first printed works are said to have emerged in China in the 10th, 11th century, you actually had the first Buddhist scriptures, the lengthy Buddhist scriptures being printed completely. And then around the 12th, 13th century, it began to really spread and become adopted in the imperial bureaucracies in China, in trade, in business. But what was the technology? What was the kind of printing that people used? It was something called woodblock printing. So woodblock printing is where you take a piece of wood and you carve it out into whatever you want to write or draw, and then you can press ink upon it, press paper on that ink, and then transfer the ink onto the paper. And in that way, it would be printed. So this was something that, it kind of resembles stamps, the idea of stamping something. Stamps might have been a precursor to this printing, this form of printing. But this was something that was, very increasingly common in China from the 12th century, 13th century onwards. And what the interesting thing about this, though, is that Muslims in China also began to adopt this kind of printing. And so they were amongst the first, amongst the Muslims in the world to start printing books through woodblock technology. And so there's a whole canon of books called the Han Kitab, which is like the Chinese Kitab, which came about in the 16th, 17th centuries. They're canonical works on, basic Islamic fiqh, on aqaid, on the principles of Islam that the Chinese ulama had produced at that time. And they had done so, in Chinese, in conversation with Confucianism. They were trying to incorporate, to translate Islamic concepts into Confucian terminology so that their society could understand them. So it was a very novel kind of work that they were doing. And so their works became very prominent, very accepted. And so you had the first, editions being printed in the 1650s in different parts of China. I just wanted to show you this table to show you the scope of their commitment. So you have books that are being printed in 1657, then reprinted several decades later, all the way up to the 20th century. So the Great Learning of Islam, Philosophy of Islam, Rituals of Islam, in the Guidebook of Islam, and so forth. And so these are amongst the first Muslims to adopt printing in their context. And it's something that is often overlooked and very few people really recognize. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in the 19th century, Muslims actually printed out the entire Quran in this format as well, through woodblock printing. So in the 1860s, there was this leader called Sulaiman ibn Abdurrahman who actually rebelled against the king emperor at the time in southern China, in Yunnan, in a city called Delhi, and he established his own sultanate for several years before he was ultimately defeated. And so during that time, from the 1850s to the 1870s, he was establishing his own Islamic kind of state. He was promoting madrasas, masajid, ulama, so forth. And so he embarked upon this project to print the first Quran in woodblock printing. And so this edition was printed in 1862. Unfortunately, it was destroyed with the Qing invasion. However, several decades later, we had a second attempt to print the Quran. This happened in 1895, and pictured are the wooden blocks that were used to produce that Quran. And these are still available in this Nanjing Mosque in Kunming. They're at the mosque, and in that, just a side point on that, sometimes these wooden blocks would be kept in masajid specifically so people could come, they could bring their ink, they could bring their paper, and then they can print out their own copy of whatever text it was. It's a very useful way of spreading knowledge, and people would kind of do that to preserve knowledge over there. So that was a kind of tradition that they had. And so this Quran was printed in 1895. We still have access to the wooden blocks that were made to use it, to print it. And this is a picture of the text that was actually printed. And so here we have Surah An-Nas printed in this kind of calligraphy. And then I'm just going to zoom in so people can see. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ, and so on until the Khatima. And they have something called the colophon, which is something that marks it was part of manuscript culture where the scribe would say, okay, I have written this, completed writing this book at this date, and please pray for me. So for over here it says, Alhamdulillahi ala khitami tabi al-Qur'an al-azim مع التصحيح التام يوم الجمعة الأولى من جماد الأول في سنة 1313 هجرة خاتم الرسل بسعي الراجي إلى غفران الله الغني سليمان عبد الكريم المهاسي, or something along those lines. So all praises to Allah over the completion of the printing this great, Holy Quran with complete proofreading and correction on the day of Friday, on this first day of Jumad al-Awwal in the year of Hijri 1313 of the Prophet ﷺ, with the effort of this person who is seeking the forgiveness of his Lord, the great, or the independent. And so this gives you a view of, and the person's name was Sulaiman Abdul Karim, who wrote, who did the great work of carving out individually the wooden blocks for the Quran. And I believe there are others involved as well. It wasn't just a single effort. There are other ulama involved as well in proofreading the text. So this is an example of a printing that is often unknown and neglected. Part of the reason why it's unknown and neglected is because of the huge emphasis people place on European printing, on locating the history of printing as an European invention and Western superiority and so forth. So, but in recent times, people have been challenging that narrative and uncovering the active print culture that existed in China and East Asia more broadly. So from here, we'll move on to Europe now. So printing in Europe took off in the 15th century. We probably all know the name Gutenberg, the German inventor who devised this thing called movable type. So movable type was different from wooden block. And just to preface that, movable type had been invented already in Korea in the 11th century, in the 12th century. It was present in East Asia already. But he was the first, or among the first, to produce it, to make it possible in Europe, in Germany. And so movable type involves creating a mold of characters, of separate characters that you can place on a plate, and then attach ink to it, and then print it. So you don't have to use one single piece of wood for one page. You can change the characters, you can play around with them, and you can make revisions if you need to, and so forth. So this was his contribution. During his lifetime, he wasn't so well recognized. He wasn't very successful. He actually filed, or he went bankrupt at one time following a lawsuit. But immediately after, around his death, it spread very rapidly throughout Europe. And so it spread to Italy from there, and the Italians took it up as well. And the Italians were important because they're one of the first people to start printing in Arabic movable type, using Arabic characters. So there was a famous press, the Medici Oriental Press, which operated in Venice and in Rome around the end of the 16th century, and they began printing Arabic books using movable characters that they had molded themselves. And so their idea was, of course, connected to their religious context, so they printed out the Gospels and other religious literature. But they also printed out more secular literature on mathematics, grammar, astronomy, and so forth. So this is an example of one of the books that they printed, Nasruddin Tusi's edition of Euclid's Elements. This is printed in 1594, and we actually do have a copy of this edition at UCLA Library. So this was a treatise that covered mathematics, principles of propositions, theorems in mathematics, as well as geometry, and so forth. It was a very common textbook in Latin and Arabic in Europe and the Middle East in that time period. So it was a textbook that would sell well theoretically. And so this was one of the books that they printed. So besides this period was also notable because we had the first Quran to be printed in the world, as far as we know, at this time in Italy too. There's a Venetian printer, Alessandro Paganini, who printed his Quran in 1537 in Arabic. I'm just going to zoom in over here. This Quran was lost for several centuries until a few decades ago when it was found in a library, and people realized, oh, this was the Mus'haf that was said to have been printed by him. This wasn't accepted by the Muslims of the time, so he was not a Muslim who was printing, and he had errors in his Mus'haf. So it was a very unsuccessful edition or print run. But nonetheless, it's one of the first. And then we have another edition of the Quran. This was printed in Germany. And this one was like riddled with errors. And you could also see here the anti-Islamic flavor here, where they have listed out like Muhammad bin Abdullah under Al-Quran, almost suggesting that he is, na'udhu the author of the Quran, and so forth. But these were the editions that would be used by European Orientalists when they would be consulting their, doing their research on Islam, Muslims, the Quran at this time in Europe. And there was, of course, a lot of interest amongst Enlightenment intellectuals, Renaissance intellectuals in Islam, in the Quran at that time. So the first Muslim printed Quran actually happened in Russia, in St. Petersburg. This was conducted under the support of the Emperor, Catherine II, who at that time was trying to make very conciliatory policies towards Muslims. So she allowed Muslims to go for Hajj. She allowed them certain freedoms after a period of oppression. And so Muslims were involved in printing this Quran. And I'll zoom in over here. And so you could see, it interestingly also has a fair amount of commentary in the margins as well, even covering how different qira'at recite these verses and so forth. So this is from 1787, and the first Muslim printed Quran that we know of in the world. And a few decades later, a very similar edition was printed by Muslims in Kazan, which is also, part of that context. And so it wasn't just a one-off thing that happened, but there were several other print runs that happened afterwards. And so now that we've discussed, Europe as well, we can move on to, what we think of as Muslim lands or the Ottoman Empire. And here we can, discuss this question of why were Muslims late to printing. So this is a very common idea that is spread, very popular, that Muslims were late to printing and they were held back by religion and religious ideals. This thesis used to be very common. There actually used to be a claim that said in the 16th century, the Ottoman Sultan said printing is banned for Muslims. And this was repeated throughout secondary literature. But to this day, no evidence has been found at all suggesting that in the 16th century, the Ottoman Sultan banned printing. There's absolutely no source for this. Nobody knows where this claim originated, but it was there for a long time. But it is true that Muslims did not adopt printing until the 18th and 19th centuries. In the Ottoman Empire, printing wasn't unknown. So you had Armenians establishing their own printing presses in the Ottoman Empire. You had Jewish people printing books in Hebrew. You had Greek people publishing their own books in the Ottomans. But Muslims did not until the first Muslim-operated press was established by a particular individual named Ibrahim Mutafarrika. And so there are different theories as to why this happened. Was it due to economic reasons? So there's a huge industry of scribes who would benefit from copying out books by hand and selling them, and that was their trade. So were they afraid of losing their livelihoods by printing? That is a question that people have raised. Some people have said movable type, the kind of formatting wasn't very useful for Arabic. But again, people did print books in Arabic, so it's not as convincing. So in short, there's no clear-cut reason as to why Muslims did not adopt printing from the get-go. And one thing to also remember about this is that, what was the usefulness of printing for Muslims at the time? What was the appeal to them? So we'll see that in the story of Ibrahim Mutafarrika. Ibrahim Mutafarrika was a Hungarian convert to Islam. He was very gifted. He knew many languages. He began to work for the Ottoman diplomacy as part of very different treaties and negotiations. And he saw, through his exposure, the importance of printing. So he wrote a letter to the sultans saying on the usefulness of printing, mentioning like 10 points about why we need to start printing books. Like it'll be beneficial for Muslims, it will make knowledge more available, more cheap, it will raise the dignity of Islam, and so forth. And so he got approval. There's a firman from the Sultan which approved, validated his request. So he was able to start his printing press. He also got a fatwa from the Shaykh al-Islam saying printing is legitimate and is fine in these cases. And so he established his printing press in Istanbul in 1729. So he printed about 17 titles in total, not a lot. The first book he printed was a dictionary of Arabic and Turkish, so a lexicon, which again shows how many of the first books to be printed were actually dictionaries, lexicons, things showing the transfer of knowledge between different languages. He also published books on history, geography. He has a book on magnets and a book on the history of Bosnia, the history of Afghanistan, even the history of America, or of what he called it, Tarikh al-Hind al-Gharbi, the West India, al-Musamma bi Hadithino, like known as the New World. And so he wrote a book and he published it, but it was very fanciful. It was very mythical. So he had all these epic creatures, like humans growing out of trees and things like that. Part of that Ajaib al-Makhluqat genre of the wonders of creation genre that kind of existed. He also had in this book, which is actually held at UCLA. UCLA has most of his original printed books. He has a world map, and I just wanted to zoom in on his depiction of California. It's right here. California kind of cut off from the rest of the continent. But yeah, that's where he envisioned us to be here. So it's cool to see that. Yeah, and so all of these books are available at UCLA special collections, and anyone is welcome to come see them for themselves, by the way. Okay. So ultimately, Ibrahim Mutafarrika wasn't a great businessman, and he basically, it is said that he kind of lost, he ran out of business, he couldn't continue it, his press died after him. His books were expensive. So even though he had argued that printing books will make them cheap, his books were expensive. And they're meant for the elite. It is said that one book of his could cost as much as a horse, an entire horse. So it wasn't something very cheap. And basically he didn't succeed. So after Ibrahim Mutafarrika, you had the emergence of printing centers several decades later, mostly around the beginning of the 19th century. So in Istanbul, in the 1790s, it began to pick up again at the time. And it was driven by the government too. So in most of these places, it was driven by the government. They wanted to fund printing, use books for their military colleges, military establishments. So oftentimes it was very kind of secular books that are being printed. Religious books weren't printed. The Quran wasn't printed, for instance, by these folks until several decades later, with the exception of South Asia. So in Calcutta, printing came with the British East India Company. You had a mixture of company officials as well as missionaries, Christian missionaries, who are active on the ground in India, in Calcutta, trying to print books. They're also trying to print not only in English, but in Persian and Arabic. And so there are interesting stories where, since missionaries were involved to a large degree, they would try to recruit Muslims, print the Gospels in Persian with the hopes of converting them. And sometimes they had assistants help them out. And some of these assistants would say that they converted to Christianity. There's a story of one person who said he converted to Christianity, helped him out at the printing press, learned the trade, and then eventually, a few years later, wrote a refutation of Christianity in Persian, which caused like a huge furor amongst the Christians. And there's actually an article as far as like the U.S. about this betrayal of this native Indian who pretended to convert to Christianity, learned how to print, and then wrote a refutation of Christianity. But another point here is that religious politics stimulated a lot of the printing here. Whether it was Christian, whether it was Muslim, there were refutations being written. So rather than holding it back, religion here in this instance actually drove most of the initial activities in printing, especially in the context of colonialism, empire, and so forth. And then in Cairo, we had publishing starting from the 1820s with under the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who established the famous press of Bulaq. And again, here too is very military kind of printing grammar, textbooks, very secular kind of printing. In Tabriz as well, in Iran, you had printing in Persian being done by the state. In India, though, it was kind of unique because you didn't have a Muslim state guiding how the printing should happen, but it was independent individual Muslim scholars, mostly ulama, who began to adopt printing. And so this is an example. I have a picture here of a book printed in 1837 in Calcutta. It's a very, you can see very bearable and it's very plain. This is also in movable type. So someone had to craft individual molds for each letter and then print them out. So this is a book by Maulana Karamat Ali. He was a major alim of the time in the 19th century. He was active in propagating Islam, doing da'wah to the masses. So he would go from village to village, especially in Bengal area, to try to do da'wah to Muslims at the time. And so part of this effort, he wrote a book in Urdu about the basics of Islam. So this is Qutul Iman. And he just wrote over here, it's a very interesting passage. He wrote at the very front, इस किताब में कलिमा तैयब की तफसीर और हक़ मज़हब की तहक़ीक़ और कुरान और हदीस और फ़िक़्ह पर अमल करने का बयान है. So in this book, we talk about the confession of faith, Islam, the explanation of Islam, of religion, its true reality, and how to act upon Quran and Hadith and fiqh. इस किताब को अव्वल से आखिर तक देखने से मतलब ज़ाहिर होगा. हिंदी ज़बान में होने से बुज़ुर्ग लोग इसको हक़ीर ना जाने. मज़मून इसके बड़े फ़ायदे के हैं. So he talks about how this book is beneficial from beginning to end, but also because this book is written in Hindi or in Urdu, Buzurg log, our elders, our scholars should not consider this book to be lowly or cheap or inferior in value, but it has lots of benefit in it. So this is a person who was actively trying to reach out to a more common language, Urdu, at the time, rather than writing in Persian or in Arabic, the more established scholarly languages at the time in South Asia. He went out of his way. He risked some kind of potential, slight or belittlement in writing in Urdu because of his attempt to reach out to the awam, reach out to the public and write something. And so in this book, he explained, for instance, the meaning of Islam, the kalima tayyib. He also expounded upon the madhahib and how to do taqleed of the madhahib, how to follow a legal school, because a lot of people were confused about that. So what does it mean to do taqleed? What is the justification for doing taqleed, of following a legal school? How do we follow the hadith in Quran and so forth? So these were hot topics that were coming up as printing spread, as common people gained access to the Quran and Hadith and other kinds of debates that were going on at the time. And this is all just back in 1837 in Calcutta, so it's very early onwards. Yeah, and so part of this, you'll see this here too. This is the first Quran with Urdu translation that I found printed in India from 1829 in Calcutta. So this also is printed in movable type, so meaning someone had to mold each individual letter in a cast and then use it and print it. Here they have the Quranic text, and then they have translations in Urdu in between the lines, in between the Arabic. And the translation that was used was the translation written by Shah Waliullah's son, Shah Abdul Qadir Dehlawi, which was famous in that time period. So he wrote kind of a backstory as to why he printed it. He said, I've been realizing that Muslims need to have access to the Quran in the original meanings in Urdu. And so with great urgency, I went and got the approval of my Sheikh, Shah Ishaq Dehlawi, the part of the family of Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, as well as Sayyid Ahmed Bareilly, Sayyid Ahmed Bareilly, the famous scholar of the Tariqa Muhammadiyya at the time. And so I got their approval to print it. They were very supportive of this idea, and they allowed me to print it. Some people were upset that I'm going to seek the dunya by printing this, but they don't understand its importance and need. And so this entire Quran was produced in the condition of wudu. No paper was allowed to touch the floor. It was done with utmost respect and so forth. He wrote all of that in his back end. So again, it was a kind of a new step he was taking on his own. And so he was mentioning his justifications for doing that. And again, this is part of the larger trend of print being making knowledge more accessible to the common people, to people beyond people who go to madrasas, schools, and so forth. One of the other major inventions that happened at this time was the invention of lithography, which is a different way of printing. So movable type, you had individual characters being molded and you apply them to a frame. In lithography, you just take a piece of stone, limestone, you apply a solution of like oil and water, and you can carve it into it. So it made it much more flowing, much more accessible to people, for scribes, for calligraphers to write and design their own books. So here are examples of the kind of printing, designs and covers that occurred that would be impossible otherwise. And so this was, part of Muslim print culture in South Asia, where they would decorate their books with a lot of designs, flowers, geometrical designs, calligraphy, and so forth. I'm just going to comment a bit about these two books. So one is a collection of small treatises on Hajj. So it's meant to be a Hajj guide. This was produced by Shah Ishaq Dehlawi, the great muhaddith, and again in Urdu. So trying to make the Hajj rituals, the du'as, more accessible to people, to travelers as they were going. And then we have Nasihatul Muslimin, also another book, directed directly to the Muslims, to the general Muslims. Nasihatul Muslimin, saying, come back to Tawheed and avoid shirk and be sincere and so forth. So again, general appeals to the awam. And so lithography really took off in South Asia, in India. Muslims in India used it incredibly, like for most of their publications. It wasn't so common in Cairo or in Istanbul. It wasn't used as massively over there. Over there, movable type continued, so you had more stilted, at least more aesthetically stilted kinds of publications coming out over there. And so this is a very small overview of print, technology. There's lots more we could talk about. There's also printing in Southeast Asia, which happens around this time, printing in North Africa, and so forth. We could also, discuss the impact of printing. So some people for a long time, there's this argument that print is an agent that causes change. These are more theoretical arguments. So is it technology that is driving the change, or is it something that humans have agency over? And so historians now kind of argue that it's a combination of both. It's not just, you have the printing press, and then boom, you have new kinds of, religious practice or new kinds of religious ideologies or so forth. But it's a tool that people can use to address their needs. So if someone feels a need to address the awam, to reform Islamic practice, they can use that tool and so forth. And then there's the question of democratization of knowledge, right? Like now, everyone has access to knowledge. Everyone can start a printing press and start publishing books themselves. Who is the arbiter of true scholarly knowledge anymore? And so these are issues, of course, that we still deal with, especially so in the digital age with social media and influencers and YouTubers and whatnot. But it's something that people have been debating for a long time. So finally, we're at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to show you some examples of some books from these periods that I was able to bring from UCLA. They're not in special collections, so they can circulate and I can bring them. People can check them out. So there's a lot to choose from, and so I had to filter out something that I thought might be more interesting. Here we have a dictionary, a vocabulary of Persian, Arabic, and English, printed in London in 1810. I hope you can all read or catch it over there. You can also zoom in if need be. So this is a dictionary of Persian, Arabic, and English. You can see here the Arabic is being printed as well. And then you have A for Arabic and P for Persian. So it's combined in the whole list. But, when you look at this, just, it's easy to think of it just as like a dictionary, okay, like a vocabulary. But this was an instrument of colonialism, of imperialism. This was how Orientalists, missionaries learned Persian, learned Arabic, and began to get the power to govern, South Asia, to make new theories, ideologies about what true Islam is or what Islam actually is. This is how they're able to govern, in South Asia. So this was like a vehicle of colonialism, of imperialism, of all sorts of things, and it's easy to underestimate it. But, and this very book itself might have been handled by those Orientalist missionaries themselves in their quest to subjugate South Asia. So don't underestimate, the power of the significance of these books. This is a smaller book printed in Germany. It's just a volume from 1001 Nights, printed in Arabic. Here is the German cover, so printed in 1831 by a professor. And again, part of their attempt to learn Arabic literature, to become scholars of it, to master it, often for political purposes, sometimes for, academic purposes as well, but it's all kind of mixed into it. So here we have something from Germany. This is an interesting book, so you can see how it's shiny. It has gold edges. Over here it has a nice little clasp. I can zoom out. Over here. So it looks like an important book. And when you open it, you realize it's the Persian Injil that was printed by missionaries to propagate Christianity at the time. So this was the kind of efforts that people made in converting and spreading Christianity at the time. Moving on to the next book. So here is a book from, I believe it was, this is from Tabriz, from Iran, so printed in 1826. It's the history of the Qajar dynasty, so the empire ruling Iran at the time. So just an example of something all the way from Iran from the 1820s, 200 years old over here. So then moving on to the next book, we have a small booklet, just to give you an example. This is a grammar of Farsi, Qawaid al-Farsiya, in Ottoman Turkish. So it's written in Ottoman Turkish, and it's meant for students at the imperial official schools, civil servants in the Ottoman Empire, to learn Farsi. And it's interesting, you can see how it starts with Alhamdulillah alladhi allamana qawaid al-lughat al-farisiyya. So it starts in Arabic, all praises to Allah who taught us the principles of the language of Farsi. And then it goes on to Ottoman Turkish after the Wabard. And there it has a discussion of Persian grammar. And I just wanted to show the last parts. Here are the verb tables, so morphology. This is how they organize them. So learning the Persian verbs. So you have gard, then you have fi'l mazi, bina ma'lum, mufrad, muzakkar ghaib, mufrad. And then you have in ma'nasa, LD, bil ghaib, and so forth. So it's giving the Turkish translation as well as the morphology. It is singular, plural, feminine, masculine, third person, second person, and this is how people would learn their Persian verbs, their morphology. This was printed in 1256 Hijri, 1256 Hijri, so around 1840s CE, so it's almost 200 years old. And then I wanted to give you an example of lithography. So here is a book printed, kind of cut out, but this is Tarikh al-Iqbal, Tarikh Bhopal. This is a history of the state of Bhopal in India, printed in 1291. It's in Urdu, so it gives a history of the strait of Bhopal. And Bhopal would actually go on to become a seat of learning, of publishing, especially with the scholar Siddiq Hassan Khan, who established a printing press and began to print very prolifically in Arabic at the time. So yeah, these are some examples of books, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. I guess one note I can end on to wrap it all up is the like incredible, like mind-blowing difference between how available or how unavailable books and knowledge used to be just 100, 200 years ago to the common person, and how they're available they are now. Like now we can take our smartphones and read like libraries and libraries of information. We have mushafs, on our phones. We have mushafs in every house. Before that, before 100, 200 years, you didn't have that. Every house didn't even have its own mushaf, right? It was rare. And so something to reflect on, like the availability of knowledge, the presence of all these tools, and what are we doing with them? How are we taking advantage of them? Are we using them to just scroll through and get notified and get our stimulations by watching cat videos or something like that? Or are we taking advantage of the incredible, like mind-blowing knowledge that we have access to? People worked so hard, spent years and years just crafting, putting together one mushaf in China, that could be available for people. And now we have it on our phones, and how often do we even read it, and so forth. The Quran. Yes. That could be one. Yeah, that could be one idea too. Like it was, the Ottomans might have had negative experiences with the Italian printers, the Christian, the missionary agendas that they had. But it's debatable because like in South Asia, under colonial rule, Muslims were like picked up printing like immediately, almost in the 19th century, and they used it to fight back against colonial rule as well. So there wasn't that kind of opposition to printing. Yeah, it depends from from region to region. It's not one blanket thing. Yes. Yeah, so the Chinese Quran was authentic. It was made by Muslims. The, yeah, so there was a first edition of the Chinese Quran. Um, let's see, in 1862. That was destroyed during the invasion. A second printing came about. That was also authentic. That was fine. It's still there today. The one that was inauthentic was the one produced by an Italian printer, all the way in Italy, back then. Yeah. Yes. Sure. Um, yeah, you'd have to Google the name. Um, there's a book by someone called Niall Green, Terrains of Exchange, and he discusses this kind of phenomenon like conversion, printing, missionary competition, and how that impacted, printing. So that's where you'll find the reference to this person too. Yeah, anyone can come. There's no restrictions. It's free. You just have to register online, make an account. If it's in special collections, you're gonna have to request your materials in advance, like a day or two in advance, and then you can view them in the reading room um, whenever you come. Yeah. Yes, you can come with kids. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, so there are some differences he made. So his printing press was also metal, and he used a special combination of like ingredients, materials. The one in Korea was wooden, so it was different. Um, and there are other like technical differences people mentioned as well. But the basic idea of having movable type wasn't his. Yeah, yeah, yeah. From the 10th or 11th century. Yeah. Yes. Um, the first people to make paper on a wide scale, perhaps, yeah. Muslims were one of the most, especially in medieval times, one of the most like bibliophile civilizations. They produced paper mills, uh, and they exceeded Europe at that time as well. When it comes to China, I'm not so sure if like which way the balance would tip. But if you consider Muslims, throughout from Morocco to South Asia, then yes, it was a very paper-centric civilization in history. Um, it was used for religious purposes, for business, for trade, for having contracts. That was also very important for business as well. Yes. It was, well, from what we know, it was an attempt to sell to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire. So the Italians are active traders. They were, very prominent in business. They were supplying Muslims with paper. Muslims in the Ottoman Empire got a large proportion of their paper, just physical paper, from Italy. And so part of publishing would have been, at that time, would have been to just sell books to them, have a market. Yeah, in the 16th century. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So in South Asia, in British India, you had a situation where individuals could open their own independent presses, relatively low cost with lithography, and began printing books. Uh, though there was censorship, but they had a larger degree of autonomy and independence than, for instance, in Istanbul or Cairo or Beirut at the same time period. So I would say um, it's difficult to imagine the Deobandi, Barelvi, Ahli Hadith movements without their, you know, excessive use of printing books, pamphlets, newspapers, technologies. It was part and parcel of their, their da'wah to the public, even their debates amongst each other. But was it the reason why printing took off in India? I would say it played a big role. Most of the earlier printers were ulama, so and then the Barelvis, the Abandis, they came several decades later, but it's part of that tradition of ulama taking active involvement, owning presses, editing books, printing them out themselves. So it was part of I think it was a result of ulama taking the press very actively at the time, in ways that they weren't allowed to at the time in Cairo or in Istanbul. Yes. So I wouldn't think there would be a large market for Arabic amongst the Italians themselves, or in Europe. There'd be groups of scholars or Orientalists, but it wouldn't be that large. Uh, from what I would think, it was more to sell books, as they would be selling other things. They want to sell books as well to the Middle East, and they also printed Christian texts, Gospels, and so forth. So they were also interested in that element as well, spreading Christianity. Um, yeah, they had now Latin translations of many of the Arabic books too at that time. So yes, uh, probably until the last few decades. Yeah, I would say. Is it true that the Bible is the most printed book in the world? Yeah. All right. If that's it, then Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you for coming here, and I guess see you another time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, inshallah.